.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. 100 years ago today, civil rights pioneer Rosa Parks was born. It was February 4th, 1913. On December 1st, 1955, when she was 42 years old, she refused to give up her seat to a white man on a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She was arrested, convicted of violating the state's segregation laws. Her act of resistance led to a 13-month boycott of the Montgomery bus system that would help spark the modern-day civil rights movement and launch Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. We want to go to a clip of Rosa Parks in her own words. In the midst of the boycott, April 1956, she spoke to Pacifica Radio about the action she took.
I left work on my way home December 1st, 1955, about 6 o'clock in the afternoon. I boarded the bus downtown in Montgomery on Coates Square. As the bus proceeded out of town, on the third stop, the white passengers had filled the front of the bus. When I got on the bus, the rear was filled with colored passengers, and they were beginning to stand. The seat I occupied was the first of the seats where the Negro passengers take as they on this route. The driver noted that the front of the bus was filled with white passengers, and there would be 2 or 3 men standing. He looked back and asked that the seat where I had taken, along with 3 other persons, one in the seat with me and 2 across the aisle, was seated. He demanded the seat that we were occupying. The other passengers very reluctantly gave up their seats, but I refused to do so. I want to make very certain that it is understood that I had not taken a seat in the white section, as has been reported in many cases. An article came out in the newspaper on Friday morning about the Negro woman overlooked segregation. She was seated in the front seat, the white section of the bus, and refused to take a seat in the rear of the bus. That was the first newspaper account. The seat where I occupied, we were in the custom of taking this seat on the way home, even though at times on the same bus route, we occupied the same seat with white standing if their space had been taken up, the seats had been taken up. I was very much surprised that the driver at this point demanded that I remove myself from the seat. The driver said that if I refused to leave the seat, he would have to call the police, and I told him, just call the police. He then called the officers of the law. They came and placed me under arrest, violation of the segregation law of the city and state of Alabama and transportation. I didn't think I was violating any. I felt that I was not being treated right, and that I had a right to retain the seat that I had taken as a passenger on the bus. The time had just come when I had been pushed as far as I could stand to be pushed, I suppose. They placed me under arrest.
That was Rosa Parks speaking in April 1956 in the midst of the Montgomery bus boycott. She'd refused to stand up for a white passenger just a few months before, December 1st, 1955. Rosa Parks is often described as a tired seamstress, no troublemaker. The fact was, she was a troublemaker, a first-class one. At the time of her arrest, she was secretary of the local NAACP. She raised money to defend the Scottsboro boys in a rape case that was trumped up, attended trainings at the Highlander Folk School of Tennessee. In fact, she'd sat down in the bus before and refused to get up for white passengers. When she died in October 2005, she became the first African-American woman to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Well, I just recently sat down with Jeanne Theoharis, a historian, author of the new book, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. She's a professor of political science at Brooklyn College, has written extensively about the civil rights and Black Power movements. I began by asking her to tell us the story of Rosa Parks.
This is a story of a life history of activism, of a life history, as she would put it, of being rebellious, right? That starts decades before her historic bus stand and continues decades after. And so very much what the story I'm trying to tell in this book is the story of that scope. It begins, her grandfather was a supporter of Marcus Garvey, and so that is really where she gets her start, is with her family, her mother and grandparents, and they sort of inculcated her in a sense of pride and a sense that you demand and expect respect from people around you. And so it is that spirit that she then brings into the world. She marries Raymond Parks, the first real activist she ever met.
Marcus Garvey was?
Marcus Garvey headed the Universal Negro Improvement Association. He was a Pan-Africanist and also a proponent of sort of black nationalism and black pride, and her grandfather was a supporter. So she meets her husband, Raymond Parks, and he is working on the Scottsboro case. This is 1931. And the Scottsboro case, these are 9 young men, ages 12 to 19, who get arrested riding the rails, right? This is the Great Depression. And very quickly the charge turns to rape, and very quickly they are all sentenced to death, except the youngest one. And so a support movement grows up.
These are black boys, teenagers, and white young women,
right,
girls.
Basically, these young boys are riding the train like many people did. When they get arrested, it is discovered there are 2 young white women riding the train. And it is that moment where these 9 young men, again, ages 12 to 19, where the charge then turns to rape. They were not originally arrested for rape. And so this support defense committee, this grassroots defense committee, grows to defend these 9 young men. And Raymond Parks is part of that movement, and that's what he's doing when she meets him. And so he's sort of the first activist she met, and in many ways that her political development as an adult starts with sort of being a newlywed with Raymond and working on the Scottsboro case.
And what happened to the Scottsboro boys?
Ultimately, they are not executed. I mean, that movement really prevents that travesty of justice from happening. So then in 1943, she sees a picture of a classmate attending a local NAACP meeting, and she realizes that women can be part of the NAACP, and so she decides to go and attend a Montgomery NAACP meeting. And she's the only woman there, and they're having branch elections, and so she is elected branch secretary at her very first meeting in 1943. And that begins a decade of activism right before her bus arrest, where she is working with the NAACP, and she's working with a man by the name of E.D. Nixon. And E.D. Nixon is a sleeping car porter, and he's active in the Union of Sleeping Car Porters. And he and Rosa Parks want to transform the branch into a more activist branch. And so he actually runs for president and wins in 1945. And he and Parks set about to investigate cases of white brutality, work on black voter registration. And this is very controversial. And in fact, there's controversy in the branch. There are many middle-class members who oppose this. They try to unseat Nixon and to a certain extent Parks, but that does not work. And so for this decade before her stand, she is doing this very dangerous work. You know, I think we say NAACP today, and it sounds not so dangerous, but to be an NAACP activist in the 40s doing what she's doing, she's traveling the stage, she's taking testimony of people, she's trying to get them to sign affidavits. That is extremely courageous work, and there's sort of only a small handful of people in Montgomery doing, you know, sort of committed to doing that work.
So how does this moment happen? Actually, as you point out in the book, it wasn't the first time Rosa Parks sat down on the bus and refused to get up. But explain what was different when she tried it the first time and when she tried it in 1955.
So there's a, right, as you mentioned, there is a longer history of bus resistance in Montgomery. There had been numerous cases sort of in the decade after World War II, before her arrest in 55, of people getting arrested on the bus. And she's very familiar with many of these cases. So she knows what can happen. A neighbor of hers in 1950 is arrested, thrown off the bus, and killed by police. The young Claudette Colvin in March of 1955 is manhandled by police when she is arrested for her refusal to move. Parks herself had made various stands on the bus. She abhorred the practice that many bus drivers insisted on, where black people would have to pay in the front, get off the bus, and reboard in the back of the bus. And she refused to do that. She'd been kicked off the bus by this very same bus driver a decade earlier for refusing to do that. She'd had trouble with other bus drivers. She described some bus driver passing her by because he didn't, he felt like she was she raised trouble. So she had this sort of history of bus resistance. There is this larger history of bus resistance in Montgomery. And then we get to December 1st, 1955. One other thing is that summer in August, she had gone for a 2-week workshop to Highlander Folk School. They're having a workshop on school desegregation. This is 1955, so we have the historic decision in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. But then the Supreme Court comes back in 55, right, and refuses to put a timetable on it, right? It's the historic words, with all deliberate speed. And so activists like Parks, like Miles Horton and Septima Clark, who were running the Highlander workshops at the time. In Tennessee. This is a workshop to bring together people who want to push for and make a plan to implement school desegregation, because the court is clearly not going to press it forward. So she attends this workshop in August, and it is a very important and transformative time for her. She describes it as the first time she felt like she could discuss things with white people and not feel hostility. There are 48 people attending this workshop. These are all people committed to this work of school desegregation. So both her own spirit really lifts. She talks about loving Miles Horton's sense of humor, getting to just eat and be in an interracial space that was a matter-of-fact interracial space, that people just ate together, they shared rooms together, they sat outside together, that freedom was also transformative personally. So she comes back, and then in some ways the atmosphere, the segregation in Montgomery, the conditions become harder to bear, I think. So the evening of December 1st, 1955, she's gotten off work. She actually decides to wait for a less crowded bus, so she goes to the drugstore, buys a few things, and boards the bus around 5:30 at night. She sits in the middle section, right? One of the myths is that she was sitting in the white section. She was not. She was sitting in the middle section. The middle section was sort of a no man's land in that the bus driver could ask you to move from that section, even though Montgomery City Code at the time said black people did not have to get up out of their seats if there was no seats available. But bus drivers routinely violated that city code. So that night, she's sitting in the middle section. There are 4 black people sitting in this row. And at the 3rd stop, the bus fills up, and there is 1 white man standing. And by the terms of Montgomery segregation, all 4 people will have to get up so that 1 white man can sit down. And the bus driver, James Blake, who, like all bus drivers in Montgomery, is carrying a gun, orders them to move. And she refuses. He says, "I'm going to have you arrested." She says, "You may do that." He gets off the bus, and he first calls his supervisor, and the supervisor says, "Well, get her off the bus." The supervisor, I want to repeat that, just says, "Get her off." He does not say, "Have her arrested." Blake calls the police. The police come and evict her from the bus, and she believes the police don't want to arrest her. It is Blake who sort of takes that sort of final historical step and says,
he's a white driver.
He's a white driver. All the drivers in Montgomery are white. I think one of the less known facets of the Montgomery bus boycott is that it's also pressing for black bus drivers. So yes, he is a white driver. The police, she describes also in those moments while Blake is off the bus calling, people grumbling, right? People are clearly nervous. What's going to happen? The police, take her off the bus. Blake says he wants to sign a warrant. He's going to come after his run to sign the warrant, and they take her to jail. And she describes the moment in various ways. She describes it as she'd been pushed as far as she could be pushed, and that to get up meant that she consented to this, and she did not consent. But one of my favorite passages is also that she talks about finding her arrest annoying. And I think this speaks to how she does not necessarily believe that some movement is going to happen, right? She's taken the stand because she thinks it's important. But she finds it annoying because she's actually working on this youth workshop for the weekend, and she sees this sort of as a distraction. And now she's gotten herself arrested, right? And who knows how long this is going to take, and who knows what's going to happen, and who knows if some sort of violent thing is going to happen to her. And so in that moment, it's a very hard moment, and then it's also a moment where she in no way can see what's about to happen.
Jeanne Theoharis is the author of the new book, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. On this 100th anniversary of the birth of Rosa Parks, we'll continue our conversation in a minute. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.